Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the Siege of Oswego in 1756 is not a commonly studied battle at all, and the internet isn't exactly overflowing with records of it. I have, however, used my magical historian powers of getting lucky and finding a few A+ sources on archive.org to compile what I believe is the first ever educational video about this battle. B-list indeed! Ha ha ho! Buckle up, cause we're in for a journey. So there were three main sources that I used for this. The first, of course, is our friend Peter's description of the battle. He actually gives a pretty comprehensive and accurate account of the events of the battle, as well as the battle's implications. But as a standalone source for understanding what went on during this siege, it's a bit much to digest if you're not already familiar with the basic outline of events. The second source I used can be found in the link in the description, which is a compilation of writings about Oswego. It comes from the British officers in New York City, relating the story they heard from a group of 8 Frenchmen who, long before the battle, deserted the French army and went to fight with the English. They fought during the siege, but when they heard the last fort was going to be surrendered, they were scared of what the French army would do to traitors and deserters. So rather than being taken prisoner, they snuck out of the fort, somehow made it past the French besiegers, and found their way all the way back to New York. This source is one of the briefer ones. My third source is a French one, written by the Governor-General of the French Army in Canada, Marquis de Vaudreuil. Marquis de Vaudreuil? Marquis de Vaudreuil? 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 I am actually trying my best. For the purposes of this video, I will call him Marquis de Vaud. French speakers, I am sorry. Anyway, Marquis de Vaud writes a comprehensive, easy-to-read, easy-to-understand account of the battle, telling us nearly everything the French were doing during the battle, giving a final count of loot and prisoners taken by the French after the battle, and portraying the overall surprise felt by the French side at how soon the British garrison was willing to surrender their stronghold. With all these, there were 2 matters of confusion I had when I started reading about the battle, but after that, the events were easy enough to understand. The first thing that confused me was the geography. A fort is a pretty large structure and usually contains a significant amount of people. Forts are not prone to disappearing or walking off, and even if they were, it's fair to say its new location would quickly become common knowledge. What confused me was that Peter's description of Oswego clearly mentions 3 forts. There was the old fort surrounded by the settlement, so called because it's old. There were also 2 other forts, Fort Ontario and Fort George, each about 450 yards from the old fort, and each only a few years old at the time of the battle. The old fort is clearly located on the east side of the river, as is stated by every account I've read. Fort Ontario guards the opposite side of the river up on a big hill. Again, pretty easy to find out. Fort George, however, was harder to locate. Peter's account, when he first talked about where the forts were located, doesn't mention which side of the river Fort George is on, only that it's about 450 yards from the old fort. Thanks. Of all the maps I saw in the compiled documents linked below, none of them actually show Fort George, and that third fort, not having played any pivotal role in the battle, isn't mentioned much at all. But it was there. Where exactly? Well, let's do some deducing. Peter mentions that it was about 450 yards from the old fort, and Marquis de Vaud mentions it's on the east side of the river past the old fort on a hill. Given that information, I would put it just a little to the west of where Montcalm Park is today. Do not take my word for it, I'm just guessing based on some things I read. If someone else tells you Fort George was somewhere else nearby, believe them, not me. So now that we have the location issue figured out, the second point of confusion was names. Williamson names the forts Fort George, Fort Ontario, and the Old Fort. Other British sources agree on the name of Fort Ontario, but often refer to the old fort as Fort Oswego, which is the official name. Also the name of the Native American trading hub surrounding the old fort, if you were an English speaker. To the French, the name of the settlement and the old fort was Chouaguin. Fort Ontario was called the same by Marquis de Vaud and Marquis de Montcalm, as was Fort George in the brief places where it was mentioned. So Fort Oswego is also the old fort, which is also Fort Chouaguin. Fort George is Fort George, and Fort Ontario is Fort Ontario. Simple enough when you have someone to explain it to you, complex enough when you're reading through primary source documents and comparing geographic descriptions of forts. Okay, finally, now that we have all this set up, let's get started. Summer, 1756. A Native American trading post turned military garrison on the southern coast of Lake Ontario, in what is now upstate New York. The settlement had been around for years, run by the British, who profited from the trade brought there by natives from every Indian nation for miles around. The French, taking advantage of poorly mapped frontier lands and vaguely worded land claims, held the sentiment that the British in Oswego, or Chuaguan as the French called it, were trespassing on French-Canadian land. As it is, the French knew that the natives were getting alcohol from the British there and using the alcohol to degrade their own societies, not to mention that the French wanted to corner the market on the fur trade, but it wasn't like there was much they could do about it, at least not without a war. The war started in 1754, on the continent at least. In Europe, the fighting wouldn't start until later. The frontier lands in many parts of the colonies would be devastated. The French and their Indian allies would win battle after battle, inch after inch, scalp after scalp. And yet, this small outpost that served as Britain's only stronghold on the Great Lakes, and the first line of defense on the far western border of the New York province, the place that had less than 100 British soldiers guarding it until mid-1755, the port that had an embarrassing naval garrison, the place with 2 shiny new well-placed forts and not enough soldiers to defend them, remained free from siege for a whole 2 years of this war. But the siege did come. In February of 1756, Marquis de Vaud, leader of the French army in Canada, becomes aware that there are only about 600 British troops in Chuaguan. This comes as a surprise. The French army and navy had been viewing the situation on the Great Lakes as sort of a Cold War standoff. The British would take a French fort on some other shore of the lake if they could, and the French would take Chuaguan, the only British stronghold of the lake, if they could. The British had been viewing this standoff much the same way. However, thanks to blunderous military campaigns in other parts of the frontier, they didn't have enough troops to commit to Oswego that they could hope to launch an attack from it. The fort, for the time being at least, would remain a distant set of eyes and ears to the British, as well as an informal border to their territory. A scout report of an embarrassing military situation at the outpost received, Marquis de Vaud started preparing to just kinda march down there and just take it. The person Marquis de Vaud sent down was a military commander called Marquis de Montcalm, but they would need a lot of time to put together a big enough army and march them down there. Until then, the skirmishes, both on and around the lake, continued throughout the summer, as did the parties of hundreds of Indians going around the wilderness and scalping any English they could find. As for the logistics of the attack, as much as they had been wanting to take Chuaguan, they knew it would be a hard task, even with the incompetent British garrison. The terrain to get there was less than welcoming, and they had no guarantee that the defenders wouldn't be able to drive them off once they got there. The only reason they finally went through with it was because of how weak they saw the garrison was. Optimistically, they put together an army of 3,000 soldiers, mostly Canadian militia, and set off. It was a hard journey. They did not travel fast. They did not travel in luxury. They had to spend their time beating a path through a wooded country that had, to quote Montcalm, no other roads but rivers filled with falls and rapids. On August 10th, the French arrived on the east side of the settlement and set up camp upriver from Ontario. Their arrival had been preceded by a naval engagement which crippled many of the British boats at Oswego. The Brits still had at least 3 vessels that were in good enough condition to sail up the river and scalp the French camp, though. They did so on the 11th, and, in a hopeful act, shot a few cannons at the French. The French shot their own cannons right back at them, and the boats were forced to retreat. In the meantime, the French started digging in and fortifying their position, while their Indian allies would walk straight up to the walls of Fort Ontario and start shooting guns at the defenders, who were shooting back at them. On the 12th, more French soldiers came and joined the main army. The British watched from the walls as, after dark, they started digging a trench network. Trenches, during this time, were used almost exclusively in siege warfare. It was the standard solution to the problem of, we need to get soldiers over the walls of this fort, but if we just march them straight towards the walls, out in the open in tight formation, they'll get shot by cannons. The way they did this was by starting an outer circle, out of cannon range of the fort. Once that was sufficiently long and deep, they would go in a zigzag pattern as they dug their way towards the walls. Anyone shooting cannons at them would have to be very good at beer pong in order to score a hit. In addition, having diggers work mostly after dark made it even harder for artillery to hit them. Once the zigzags were close enough, they could start digging an inner circle until the troops were ready to just run through the trenches with ladders and grappling ropes and whatever else, and have a much safer march to the base of the fort. Either that, or they could put artillery in the inner circle and start blasting away at the walls from a safe underground location. A good example of this can be seen in the Battle of Yorktown during the American Revolution. Well, the outer circle of the French trench was finished at 5 a.m. on the 13th of August. They ran into a few stubborn tree stumps, but they were able to work past it. The British saw the French approaching. They saw the trench expanding. They knew the French would be able to overrun the fort soon. Maybe tomorrow, or maybe the next day. During the 13th, they fired bravely, but they had a plan. While some of the defenders were firing cannons continually at the French, the rest were packing up as many important things as they could. They kept shooting, until the very last minute. Until 11 p.m. That was when the Brits in Fort Ontario packed up and went across the river. huffing it to Fort Oswego as fast as they could. They managed to get across without anyone getting hurt. Before first light, the French had occupied Fort Ontario and were ready to start using the cannons of the fort against them. Yeah, letting that fort go didn't lead to the best outcome. The situation got even worse for them when the French sent 2,500 militia and Indians across the river. The militia traded small arms fire with Fort Oswego, while the Indians attacked anyone trying to travel between Fort Oswego and Fort George to get a message across. The siege could have gone on longer like this, and probably would have if it wasn't for a lucky cannon shot killing one of the British commanders in the fort, Colonel James Mercer. He died at around 10 a.m., after which the troops in the fort raised the white flag. An hour later, surrender was negotiated. All of the British in the fort would become prisoners of war and be treated well. The French would occupy Oswego, or Chihuahuan. Fort George would be torn down by the French army. Rather than die in the old fort, the soldiers agreed to the terms. They opened the gates, and 1,640 British are taken prisoner from both forts. Immediately after marching out the healthy ones, the Native Americans rush into the old fort and start doing what they do, taking scalps from the sick and wounded. The French had promised safety and fair treatment to the prisoners. Instead, Peter Williamson takes note of the terrifying screams of the dying. And what could the French do? Fight against their ally in defense of a defeated enemy? Marquis de Vaud writes about the acts of the natives. This species of animal I look upon as mad dogs. When they are intoxicated, they are uncontrolled. The war goes on. The war crimes would be forgotten. The French army now had the ability to strike all across upstate New York, all the way to Albany. The defenders of Oswego, after a few days, would be taken to Montreal, and then further north into Quebec, to be ransomed back to England after a few months. I am bad at concluding videos.